Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my monthly recommendations video for the month of August. Now, monthly recommendations is a Goodreads group. Every month they give us a topic and we can come up with a list of books to recommend for that topic. It's open to booktubers, bloggers, anyone with a platform to share recommendations. Now, the topic for August is oldies, and the way the group is defining oldies is anything earlier than 2010. Now, I was actually surprised when I looked at my Goodreads read shelf and sorted it by publication date that prior to 2010 is actually less than 50% of the books on my Goodreads shelf. But it is pretty darn close to 50%. So if I picked just my favorite books published prior to 2010, that would be a pretty select group of like all-time favorites that you've seen me recommend a whole lot of times before on this channel. In order to generate what I think is going to be a more interesting list of recommendations, I did a sort of my Goodreads read shelf by publication date, and I have picked the top 10 oldest books on that list that I gave a 4-star rating or higher to. I actually don't have any 5 stars on this list, so these are all going to be 4-star books for me. For context, I've been on Goodreads for a few years now, tracking my reading there, so that's the period of time that this is going to cover for things I've read. When I joined, I did add a few books to my read shelf that I had read recently enough that I could rate them with some confidence. So I've got at least one of those on this list that I read some time ago, and then I actually have 2 books on this list that I just read for the Booktubeathon last month that I talked about in my last video, which was my wrap-up for that. So I might not have a ton of like great all-time classics on my Goodreads shelf from my last several years of reading, but I have, I think, a really interesting variety of books here. So I'm going from newest to oldest. The first book on my list is Brat, Farrar by Josephine. This was published in 1949. This is a classic mystery novel. This is one of the sort of interesting mystery novels that's not really a whodunit. It takes a long time for the nature of the mystery itself to come to the forefront in the book. Mostly, this is about a guy named Brat Farrar who infiltrates the Ashby family, posing as the long-lost heir to the family fortune, the eldest son of the family who went mysteriously missing long ago. And the fun thing about this book is that because he's the protagonist, we know that he's not actually Patrick Ashby. We know that he's a fraud, but he's a really likable protagonist anyways, and Josephine gets you to root for him. So if you want like an old vintagey kind of literary mystery thing, this is one I would recommend. The next book on my list is also a kind of old vintagey literary mystery thing, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is the one on this list that I read the longest ago, and so I remember the details less clearly. But this is about a young woman. It's first-person narration. We never learn the protagonist's name, who ends up marrying this very, very wealthy man whose previous wife, Rebecca, is dead. And it is all about her insecurities of feeling insufficient in the shadow of the mysterious Rebecca. This mass market paperback edition makes it look like a super trashy romance. And it's known as a romantic novel. I don't think, thinking back on it, that the relationship in this book is one that I would categorize as particularly romantic. It's certainly not a healthy relationship. It's a very psychological book. And at the time I read it, I deeply identified with the protagonist's insecurities. And I also think that this is a book that by the end does interesting things with the idea of the mystery genre. Next is the first fantasy book that's going to make the list, and this is The Hobbit, published in 1937. I have this gorgeous gold shimmery 50th anniversary slipcase edition. I actually obtained this physical book after I first read it. I listened to this on audio, so I've never actually read my copy of this book in print, although I will someday reread it in this shiny, gorgeous edition. But I loved the whimsy of this book. I read it in proper order before reading Lord of the Rings, and I started reading Tolkien not long before I started BookTube. I started with this before I joined BookTube, and then I read Lord of the Rings early on in my life as a booktuber. In retrospect, I think I kind of liked the lighthearted charm of The Hobbit better than some of the more serious doom and gloom and battle stuff in Lord of the Rings. It was maybe a little more to my taste, even though you can't help but admire what a huge fantasy accomplishment Lord of the Rings is. And by the way, I have still never seen any of the movies. Number 7 on my countdown is the first book I'm gonna hit here that I don't own a copy of. This is one that I got from the library. It's Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, and it was published in 1932. This is a sort of spoof of popular Gothic fiction of the time. It's about a young lady recently orphaned named Flora Post who decides that what she's going to do with her life is she's going to descend upon some distant relatives in the country who are leading this absolutely melodramatic gloom and doom existence in the countryside on a farm where everything's miserable and dreary, and she decides that she's going to modernize their lives and turn it all around, and hilarity ensues. It's kind of bizarre, and it took me quite a while to get into the feel of it, but by the end I was totally on board. Next, I have the first of the books that I mentioned having just read for the Booktubeathon, which is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. This was published in 1924. This I really enjoyed. Please do check out my Booktubeathon wrap-up where I talked about this in considerable detail, because I'm not going to repeat a ton of that here. But this was the first thing I've read by Lord Dunsany, and it will not be the last. This is rich, dense, lyrical fantasy writing with some really stunningly imaginative stuff going on that feels properly fairy tale-esque, but also you can see how it would have influenced high fantasy and epic fantasy. This is about what ensues between our world and Elfland when a lord of a town called Earl sends his son to fetch the King of Elfland's daughter, Lyrizel, and marry her so that their offspring will be of magical descent, because the Parliament of Earl have declared that they would like magic in their town, please, and of course that ends up being a way more complicated thing than they imagined it would be. This is not easy reading, but I found it to be very rewarding as a bit of a fantasy nerd. Next, I have The Complete Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde, obviously by Oscar Wilde. The Goodreads entry for this lists the publication date as 1891. Oscar Wilde published 2 separate collections of short stories, both of which are contained in this edition. The first being The Happy Prince, which was actually published in The Happy Prince and Other Tales was 1888. And then A House of Pomegranates, which is the second collection, was 1892. So I don't know where Goodreads is getting 1891 for this. But regardless, number 5 is the proper slot in this for my countdown. This is just a nice little collection of witty literary fairy tales from Oscar Wilde. I had been interested in reading some things by Oscar Wilde that weren't his plays. I'd previously only read his plays. I still haven't read like A Picture of Dorian Gray or anything. I should read that. But with any collection, some of these I liked more than others. Some of them were fascinatingly bizarre. And this is a collection of fairy tales that is not very long, and these are all the fairy tales he wrote in this one little book. So if you want to, you know, grab a volume of 19th century fairy tales where you can read all of them in not that long a time. This is one you could read. Next is the second of the 2 books on this list that I read for the Booktubeathon, and that's The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This is from 1872. This is a children's fantasy classic. It is super whimsical. It's a very easy read. Again, check out my Booktubeathon wrap-up if you'd like to hear more about this. Number 3 is pretty self-explanatory. It's Jane Eyre, which is from 1847. It's Jane Eyre. I don't know what to say about this other than if you don't know what Jane Eyre is about, Google it. Number 2 is another book that I don't have because I listened to it on audiobook. I did have a print copy once. I loaned it out to someone who moved away and I never got it back. But that is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Jane Austen is one of the authors where I unfortunately see adaptations of all of her books before I read them, and anytime I see an adaptation of something, I sort of inevitably lose the initiative to actually read the book. But Northanger Abbey is one that I've actually read in recent years and enjoyed very much. This is an early Jane Austen novel that wasn't published, I don't think, until after her death, and it's very funny. There's a lot of gentle literary satire here. You can tell that Austen is sort of gently poking fun at some of the over-the-top literature of her day by giving us a protagonist who actually believes that these things will totally happen to her, when in reality that's not the type of book she's living in. She's living in a Jane Austen romance, and those operate by very different rules. And that is the source of the comedy in this book, and it's great. And number 1 on my list is the oldest book on my shelves, not this edition of this. This is a more recent edition, but this is E.T.A. Hoffmann's Nutcracker, which is a novella-length fantasy story that is far more bizarre and strange and weird than you would think it is if you only know the ballet. Please know that this is very strange and very bizarre, but of course I like really strange and really bizarre things, so I really enjoyed reading this. This is an edition with illustrations by Maurice Sendak, which are just great and give the reading experience a whole nother level of enjoyment. Sendak's art is a really good fit for this story because it is both whimsical and strange and kind of dark. This is a translation by Ralph Manheim, and I thought as a casual reader that the translation was pretty darn good. So there you have my oldies, a strange sort of combination of literary and mystery classics along with fantasy classics and fairy tale stuffs. So let me know if you've read any of these, if you want to read any of these, what you think. Also maybe let me know what some of the genre distributions of the oldest books you have read recently are. I'd be interested to hear if any of you, like me, have been reading like older genre books, or if all of your older books are like literary classics. That's something that I'm kind of interested in. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.